5 miserable realities of medieval peasant life. Have you ever wondered what life was really like for the ordinary men and women who lived in the shadows of medieval castles? Forget the glittering crowns and noble banquets. The vast majority of people in the Middle Ages were peasants, bound to the land, trapped in poverty, and forced to endure a life that was brutal, filthy, and often tragically short. Their existence was not one of romance or adventure, but of hunger, fear, and endless toil. In this video, we uncover 5 miserable realities of medieval peasant life that history often leaves hidden behind the myths. From the filth and disease that turned every village into a breeding ground of death, to the crushing weight of taxes and forced labor demanded by their lords, peasants lived with little hope of escape. They struggled against famine, superstition, and the constant threat of war, while their daily lives were defined not by freedom, but by survival. So, the next time you picture knights in shining armor or kings on golden thrones, remember the millions of forgotten souls who suffered in silence. These are the dark truths of peasant life you were never taught in school. Reality 1. Filth and disease. Imagine waking each morning not to comfort, but to the stench of waste, damp earth, and the grunts of animals sharing your home. For medieval peasants, filth wasn't an inconvenience, it was the very air they breathed. Their huts were cramped, built of mud and straw, often without chimneys, so thick smoke from open fires coated every surface and every lung. The floor was nothing but dirt mixed with animal dung, while rats scurried across grain sacks and lice crawled through bedding. Bathing was rare and even discouraged, seen as unhealthy or sinful. Weeks, sometimes months, passed without a wash. Water sources were often contaminated, turning simple drinking into a gamble with disease. Villages became open laboratories for infection. Fleas fed on blood daily, spreading illness from one family to the next. Rats carried the unseen terror of plague. Children died in staggering numbers from diarrhea, fever, or infections, while adults feared even small wounds that could fester and kill. For peasants, disease was not an occasional visitor, but a constant companion. Every cough could signal death, every cut could spell doom, and every breath carried the foul reminder that life itself was lived in the shadow of decay. Reality 2. Hunger and starvation. If filth and disease haunted the peasant's body, hunger gnawed constantly at their stomach. Food was never guaranteed, and even in years of good harvest, most peasants lived on the edge of starvation. Their daily diet was bleak: coarse black bread, thin vegetable pottage, and perhaps a scrap of cheese or salted herring if they were lucky. Meat was a rare luxury, often reserved for feasts or stolen in desperate moments. But when harvests failed, struck down by storms, floods, or blight, famine spread like wildfire. Entire villages faced empty granaries, and families boiled weeds or ground bark into flour just to survive. Starving children begged in the streets, and parents sometimes watched helplessly as their infants wasted away. Even worse, the heavy taxes demanded by lords and the church meant peasants often had to surrender their grain while their own families went hungry. Hunger was more than an empty belly. It was a slow death that weakened the body and invited disease. Malnutrition left peasants with brittle bones, stunted growth, and little strength to endure the brutal labor demanded of them. To live as a peasant was to live with hunger as a shadow, always looming, always threatening to consume. Reality 3. Harsh labor and oppression for medieval peasants. Work was not just a duty, it was a relentless sentence. From dawn until dusk, their lives revolved around back-breaking labor demanded by both the land and their lords. Fields had to be plowed, seeds sown, weeds pulled, and harvests gathered, all with primitive tools that left hands blistered and bodies aching. Women worked alongside men, tending crops, baking bread, spinning wool, and hauling water, often while caring for children at the same time. Yet no matter how hard they toiled, freedom was a dream they could never reach. Most peasants were serfs, legally bound to their lord's estate. They could not leave without permission, marry outside their village, or even hunt the game that roamed the forests around them. Every season brought new demands, laboring on the lord's lands, repairing roads or building fortifications, all without pay. On top of this, taxes and tithes drained what little they earned, ensuring the cycle of poverty never ended. Oppression was not only physical, but psychological. The knowledge that their sweat enriched others, while their own families lived in misery, weighed heavily on them. To resist meant punishment, sometimes brutal, from fines to public humiliation. Life was endless labor under the crushing weight of a system designed to keep them bent, broken, and obedient. Reality 4. Fear of punishment and war, as if disease, hunger, and endless labor weren't enough. Medieval peasants lived under the constant shadow of punishment and war. Justice in the Middle Ages was rarely fair and often terrifying. A stolen loaf of bread or unpaid tax could mean public flogging, stocks in the village square, or worse, mutilation and execution to serve as warnings. Lords and church officials used fear as a weapon, ensuring peasants remained obedient and silent. But beyond the village walls, war was an even greater terror. Peasants had no armies to protect them. When rival lords clashed, or when foreign invaders swept through, villages became battlegrounds. Fields were trampled, homes burned, and families scattered. Soldiers looted grain and livestock, leaving peasants with nothing. Many were forced into military service, armed with little more than farm tools, thrown into conflicts they barely understood. The constant threat of violence created a world of fear and insecurity. A peasant might wake one morning to the sound of church bells, not calling to prayer, but to warn of approaching soldiers. Punishment was certain. War was unpredictable, but both could strip away life, property, and dignity in an instant. For peasants, survival meant living each day under a sword that could fall without warning. Reality 5. Lack of freedom and hopelessness. Perhaps the most miserable reality of all was not the hunger, it's the filth, or the endless toil, but the crushing absence of freedom. Most peasants were serfs, legally tied to the land on which they were born. Their lives were not their own. They belonged to their lord as much as the soil they worked. They could not leave the manor without permission, could not marry outside their lord's domain, and could not dream of owning the land they spent their entire lives cultivating. This bondage bred a deep sense of hopelessness. Ambition was stifled before it could take root. Even in times of prosperity, peasants knew their children would inherit the same chains, the same mud-soaked huts, and the same back-breaking burdens. Hope of escape was rare only through rebellion, service, and war. Or the unlikely call of the church could a peasant's fate change, and each path carried its own dangers. The medieval world was built on rigid hierarchies, and peasants stood firmly at the bottom. They watched nobles feast while their own bellies ached. Priests preached salvation while demanding tithes. And kings fought wars that destroyed villages without ever knowing the names of those who suffered. In such a world, despair was not an emotion, but a condition of life. For peasants, the future was as bleak as the present, a cycle of toil, oppression, and silence that offered little more than the faint hope of survival. The life of a medieval peasant was defined not by romance or adventure, but by filth, hunger, back-breaking labor, fear, and a crushing lack of freedom. These 5 miserable realities reveal a world where survival itself was a daily battle, and hope was a fragile illusion. Behind the glittering image of castles and kings stood millions of forgotten men and women who endured endless suffering. Their voices drowned out by the chronicles of the powerful, yet in their silence lies the true story of the Middle Ages. Without the peasants' labor, kingdoms would not have thrived, armies could not have marched, and the nobility's wealth would have crumbled. They were the backbone of medieval society, but history remembered them only as shadows. By uncovering these harsh truths, we peel back the myths of a romanticized past and confront the reality of a world where inequality, fear, and despair shaped everyday life. Perhaps the greatest lesson the peasants leave us is that power has always come at a cost paid by those with the least. If you found this journey into the darker side of history eye-opening, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Whispers Through Time, and ring the bell for more stories that history tried to bury. The shadows of the past still whisper, and together we'll uncover them all.